Welcome, class. I'm so excited about this lecture. This lecture is about primates and the early hominins leading up to the humans. And I brought a couple friends. Yes. I'm so excited. I always wanted to be a film director, so please excuse my dramatic skills. So last we talked, and just to make sure we recap, anthropology, specifically bioanthropology, which you're studying, is about evolutionary theory and how we believed over time organisms have changed from a unicellular organism that lived in the ocean to a multicellular organism that begins to live terrestrially. These are what we refer to as mammals. Now, mammals come up in the Cenozoic period after the dinosaurs have gone extinct because the dinosaurs used to prey on the mammals. So now that their greatest predator is gone, they're able to really thrive. And one of the groups of mammals are primates, who live predominantly in the trees arboreally. So for the primates, we discussed briefly some of the traits: the binocular vision, having two eyes in the front, having stereoscopic vision, the ability to see objects 3D, and also color vision, the expansion of the brain, because the brain has to analyze the information that you receive visually, especially since we demand so highly on our vision to analyze information. Second to this is our similar erect body. All primates tend to have, from head to torso, similar structures, not only our spinal cords and our limbs, but our muscles, what would be our chest. All of those things are very similar. Next to that, with the few differences we do have in our pelvises, which I'll talk about in a second, have to do with walking. But our pelvises are structured similarly. They just have emphasis in different areas. And then our legs are very similar. One of the most important things possibly about us as primates are the five fingers, the digit. We have the tactile pad, what we call it, on your hand so that you can feel things. And of course, this information gets transmitted to the brain so you can interpret what you're feeling. We have nails to protect these tactile pads because they're so important. And remember, these hands grasp the trees. You can feel the trees. You hold your body up from it. So you do need sort of a hard exterior to protect it. Claws would get in the way of grasping trees. So you have to imagine, if we did ever have claws, that our few ancestors were very successful. Poor babies. So the nails serve a very specific purpose. So not only do we have the five fingers, we have the ability to grasp and hang from trees, swing from trees, bronchiate specifically. And all these things make us uniquely primates. We also have social things that are similar. We're all omnivores. And I usually say that's just because, we may not have been at the top of the food chain, so we became scavengers at some point. We ate everything. But we do have heterodont teeth. Yes, different kind of teeth for different kind of eats. Hey, I can make a music video with anthropology stuff. That would be so cool. Yeah, okay. I just considered it. All right. So not only are the teeth different, but our diets are different. Now, there is something unique about primates socially as you're getting to in primate behavior. That there are a lot of practices we have that are similar. Number one, maturation. So you learned with the mammals that we are placental mammals, that we actually carry, and not pouched, there are pouched mammals. We carry our offspring internally, and they basically develop in this cocoon, which we may call the womb, inside the woman's body until they are birthed. Now, many other species may birth an individual that takes a few days to develop into adulthood. Not us. our individuals take long periods to develop, to mature. So we have built social systems around teaching or showing these live individuals how to exist in the world. And you see that every day with humans teaching their children how to cook, kids going to school, learning information to be productive in society so you can take care of yourself. This would be no different if we were still living in the trees and your parent had to teach you how to find food, how to hunt, what to stay away from, so that you could be safe. Same sort of social practices and hierarchies. We also see some of the same sort of family structures. You may have in some species of primates a male and a female give birth to an offspring and raise that individual, or you might see a woman give birth to an offspring and raise it with other women. Or in a larger community so that they feel protected and safe and there's greater food source because more individuals are going out looking for food. There's different ways that people have structured these societies that are very similar to the ways that we structure societies. So when they've classified all of these organisms, they've looked at these similarities, and this is why we refer to ourselves as primates, because we're so closely aligned with the apes, the monkeys, the lemurs, the lorises. All of these individuals share our characteristics. So that's primates. Ah, love it. Now, it also goes into great detail in your book about dominance hierarchies and how individuals are ranked, how males rank themselves within these societies. I think you should take another look at it. It is some interesting stuff. Absolutely. Okay, so moving on from primate behavior, now that we can assume that we're in a classification with primates, what are the ways that we are different? And so this is where we depart from being similar to the apes and we get into our specific lineage. Now, all the individuals in our lineage outside of the apes no longer exist. They're all gone. And often people will say, if evolution really happened, then why haven't the apes changed? And I have to tell you, you do not basically understand the principles of evolution if you're thinking that. What it comes down to is the environment necessitates these changes. And if the environment has not necessitated that many of the apes, like bonobos and gorillas, there's like 6 of them. 6 different species of apes. But if none of them have had to change, it is because they are successful in their environments. And we can only presume that because we were least successful with all of these species around, were we the ones to go venture off to try to find alternative ways to survive, i.e., adapt. We had to adapt to survive or die off. That's the way things work. Okay? Now, when it comes to all of the species that lead to our development specifically, we pay close attention to anatomy because it helps us really understand where we've come from. So the first skeleton I'm going to show you is the chimpanzee. And yes, it's detachable. All right, key things we always focus on when we're analyzing these things is the skull. This is referred to as a sagittal crest. It is a bony part on the top of an ape's skull. Okay? Now it's meant to hold, to attach to muscles that hold the jawline up and help you with chewing. Okay? Next thing you want to notice is the brow ridge. How it is protruding and large. This will eventually taper out for humans, and we will start to develop something like a forehead. But you see here, there is no forehead. There's the skull and there's the brow ridge. Okay. Now, some people look at eye sockets, and eye sockets are significant. So please note that when you do see different kinds of eye sockets, chimpanzees don't tend to have notably different eye sockets than humans. So that's why I'm not going to highlight it here. But other species will. I think you have a quiz where they do the tarsier eye sockets and a couple other species that you can really sort of examine it. Here you also see the teeth. So while chimpanzees do have heterodont teeth, they have a bunch of different teeth. in their mouth, the molars back here, and the incisors, and the canines. Look at the size of their canines, right? So our canines, you can tell, get smaller. So this is sort of where we pace ourselves from in human history. If we know our ancestors had, what is it, 98% shared DNA with chimpanzees, and possibly that 2% can account for how physically different we look, that 2% must be so significant. But you're bound to see a lot of similarities just because we don't know what part of that DNA is different, okay? So specifically for the chimpanzee too, we have a smaller skull, and it's shaped differently. Specifically for the chimpanzee to thrive, and they do very well in their environment. But if we come from something like a chimpanzee, and no one says we come from a chimpanzee, no one says we come from a monkey. We don't have tails. We didn't come from a monkey. But if we came from a chimpanzee-like individual, then this is the prototype for what we think the earliest ancestor looked like. Okay, now they may have had different hair color. They could have had tons of differences that were probably significant for the great apes, right? They look different to the great apes, possibly. But this is sort of our template until we find that individual. Okay. Next in the line after the apes, we talk about the Australopithecines, and there are many species before that, but Australopithecines are one of the largest and most significant for us for political reasons, that I'll tell you about after I go through the whole evolutionary thing, if I remember. If not, send me an email and tell me. I better make sure I tell you. Okay, this is Lucy. Yes, the Lucy. Okay. Now, for those of you guys who haven't gotten there yet in the class, Lucy is an individual that signifies, oh, I guess I'm telling you the political stuff already. Couldn't hold water. But Lucy signifies the ancestry of humans being in Africa. During sort of this mad dash to figure out whether evolution happened in the 1900s and to find scientific proof of it through skeletal remains, individuals were convinced, based on what they were finding, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, that humans had evolved all over the world, more specifically in Asia and in Europe. But even Darwin, as you saw at the beginning of the class, believed that evolution, if humans evolve, it probably evolved in Africa. And not because of some kind of bias towards black people, but because of the climate of Africa and how diverse it is. It produces some of the most amazing systems, ecosystems in the world, and organisms in the world. And so if you expect us to develop in any sort of conditions, you would expect it would come out of Africa. And the fact that many of the apes are in Africa just gives more credence to this idea. But for the most part, when we talk religiously too, many religions recognize Africa as the birthplace of humans, even if they don't explicitly say it, including the Bible. All right. So when they found Lucy, which is this link between the Homo genus, which we belong, we're Homo sapiens, the Homo genus, and apes, when they found Lucy in Africa and only found Australopithecines in Africa, it further proved that this theory that humans evolved in Africa, and that's where we descend from. And so you can imagine politically this was problematic for many racists out there, but that's going to have to be their personal problem. All right, now this is not typical in all Australopiths, but it's something important in Lucy. Lucy did not have large canines. Okay, now there are other Australopiths that had the canines, but when you see a species like this appear and they do not have canines, you start to wonder at what point were they eating or preparing food, right? So there's no need to tear into a large piece of meat. if you're involved in fire making and cooking. Now, fire making they will credit with the Homo genus of species, but I do want you to start to question things for yourselves and wonder what was going on with the Australopithecines diet, that there would no longer be a need for the canines. Okay. All right. So you also see sort of this same thing going on with the skull. Sort of this large shape of a skull, this bony ridge at the top, except it's a lot smoother when it comes to Australopithecines, but it still has sort of the roundness. Now, you do see a little activity here trying to figure out how this skull is going to play out. I like to think of nature and evolution as sort of this big scientific experiment in a pot cooking up different roux. Yes, I love gumbo. I'm thinking of it right now. But just cooking up all these different individuals to see which one is going to be the best. And then only time will tell based on their survival and environment. We'll see. So this is the difference in the Australopithecines. Also look at the brow ridges. Yes, the shifts are occurring. The occipital bone, the changes in the back of the skull. Now, why would the back of the skull matter? And this is something that you should pay attention to as these organisms start to shift. I can show you chimpanzee's back of the skull. It's wider. Now, the reason the back of the skull starts to shift because something starts to shift with humans, and that is particularly bipedal walking. Okay, before we did not need all the bony attachments to the skull because the weight was on 4 limbs. But when your weight changes to 2 limbs, then there is something specifically holding the skull up on top of the head, and that requires change. So you're going to start to see the changes in the back of the skull. This is Lucy. Now, other things we know about Lucy, specifically her pelvis, was a little bit more narrow than humans, but wider than apes. So what does that mean? She's somewhere in the middle, absolutely. You don't expect a completely narrow pelvis because apes have narrow pelvises because they walk on 4 limbs, and the pelvis tends to be more narrow when that's how your weight is distributed. When you walk on 2 limbs, your pelvis widens out. And this is how our pelvis looks, short and widened, so that we can put pressure on our hips to walk. Okay? Now she had something in between. She also had a divergent big toe. Now, for those of you guys who are here in this section in the course, feet become important because these early researchers I told you about, some of the racists, I'm going to pack her up while I'm talking to her because I'm a little protective over Lucy, my baby mama. But many of these researchers really thought the brain was the first thing to develop in evolutionary period. And so with Lucy, again, they found that it was walking that changed first. And this makes sense. If we were not sort of on top of the food chain living arboreally, then we ventured off on foot. And it is through the success of venturing off, walking bipedally, that we were able to eat different things and our teeth started to change, that we started to get more creative with what we were doing. And then we have the brain activity growing as well as with the diet. So bipedal walking happens first. So the fact that Lucy has a divergent big toe, and if you can think about your feet, they're sort of together like this. The divergent big toe is off to the side. Now this is good if you're going to grasp a tree. So that's why we think of it as closer to an ape. So Lucy had the ability to maybe swing from a tree and grasp a tree. But she did not have the ability, in her species perhaps did not have the ability to run because they would not have been that solid on bipedal walking to be able to run. Walk, yes. Run, not. So we also see a curvature of her spine where her body's still tilted forward, which lets us know, again, the spine, the pelvis, all these things changed first before the skull. And you could see by her skull size, the skull was not the first thing to change. So, more. Here's another Australopithecine. This is Africatus. Sorry, I've been teaching all day, and this is like my third lecture. Look at the brows. You see that? The back of the skull. See, now you guys are experts. I've told you what to look at. And we don't have teeth. I have no idea where these teeth are. See, I'm not the only one in my lab. In my skeletal closet. These people be touching my stuff. Don't get me started. Okay. So those are the Australopithecines. Australopithecines do not leave Africa. So they spread out all over Africa, but they do not leave. They also happen to live next door. Oh, not next door. What am I thinking next door? They live with a whole nother species as well called Paranthropus, which your book covers. Now, because evolution is essentially a science experiment, what it did was produce individuals with rounder skulls and smaller teeth. But it also produced individuals with the same kind of teeth and the same kind of skull as a chimpanzee. Here's a chimpanzee again. And I don't have Paranthropus, but Paranthropus has a skull just like a chimpanzee and similar teeth. So you can see the social experiment happening. But poor Paranthropus dies off. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to chuckle over that. Poor Paranthropus' soul. Paranthropus dies off, and our lineage continues. Yes, I am one of those weird people who have to clean dishes right after I use it. I'm sorry. I have to, like, put it away. You know, it's so disrespectful to leave it out. Okay. After the Australopithecines, we move into the Homos. Hey, get it. Okay, whatever. You guys. All right, so let's look at this large skull here. Yes? Sorry, the teeth are falling. Large skull, rounded skull. Now, when we get to Homo, we start to refer to even this ridge that comes up and over as a sagittal keel. Okay? You have the projecting brows, definitely very large. You see a shaping in the back, not as wide or horizontal. And then, this is Narioka Tome Boy, for those of you guys who want to connect it. And then the teeth. Yes. Now, this particular individual is quite interesting. The skull of what belonged to this person. Specifically because this individual was really tall and was found to be the age of, is it 14? It's either 8 or 14. I always mix up numbers. I need help. Okay. So this individual was a child, but yet so tall. And they were trying to figure out why this individual was so tall. And so they began to believe specifically that the individual was more developed as an adult at the age of 18. I think it's 8. The age of 8 because of diet. So they began to believe specifically protein enhanced the physical capabilities of the individual because protein does expand bones and muscle and a lot of other things, specifically your brain. So you start to see cultural changes happen with Homo that you didn't see in the Australopithecines. You see not only the use of fire, but the manipulation of fire, the manipulation of food, preparing food. You also see something quite interesting. You see travel. Homo travels out of Africa, okay? This particular genus of individuals. This is Ergaster, and I'm going to leave him out, Homo ergaster, for a second. This is Homo erectus found in China. And you'll see it's the same situation. The sagittal keel, back of the skull, brows, and teeth. Now, the differences between these two skulls are subtle, and they are classified as different species, but are they really? And this is really the juice of the argument going on. Now, we know Homo erectus, and then there's many homos in between. I'm just skipping over because it's a summary video. But Homo erectus specifically is very up for debate. It was one of the most successful homos that ever existing a million years and a little over. But this particular species traveled out of Africa, where we get the out of Africa theory or the multi-regional evolutionary theory, because people debate still to this day whether or not Homo erectus, despite the proof in Eragaster here, lived in Africa and then migrated out of Africa and populated Asia, Southern Europe, and Australia, eventually populating the Americas. Now, people debate this simply because of their own research. Now, specifically, China is very adamant that Homo erectus evolved into Homo sapiens in China on its own, while other people tend to believe that Homo erectus spread out all over the world, died off, and Homo sapiens evolved in Africa and then spread out and replaced Homo erectus. Either way, these things get very contentious between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens on their origins and their differences. I won't tell you that there aren't a lot of bias attached to both understandings of them. We are coming into a time post-slavery where Africans and African American people specifically have been told that they are less than, more animalistic, and so to then be told scientifically that humans evolved out of Africa, it's a hard pill for many groups of people to swallow. So, but that's not your problem. But nonetheless, you should know. It really begins with sort of this argument with Homo ergaster and Homo erectus, which they demanded that Homo ergaster, Nariokotome boy, no longer be referred to as Homo erectus, which is why we're calling him Homo ergaster, because they said the differences between the two, although you can't tell, are so significant that the African Homo erectus is a different species than the Homo erectus in the rest of the world. Yeah. What would Tamar say? They tried it? Alright, so let's put Ergaster and Pecking Man away. Alright, so in this expansion of Homo erectus, of course, you see all these cultural features in different places around the world. The book focuses on a couple key places like Dmancy, Georgia, which is southern Europe, Zuccotti in China, Java, Indonesia, and of course East and Southern Africa, where you really find a lot of the Homo erectus species. But as Homo erectus goes extinct, it is believed it evolves at some point into different types of species. So you may believe that in Africa, Homo erectus, after a couple other species, evolved into Homo sapiens. Some people believe, and this is still working on it. I wish I had my skull for them. But Homo erectus gets cut off at this time in Northern Europe by the Ice Age and evolves into what becomes the Neanderthals. And then in Asia, it is believed, specifically China and Indonesia, that Homo erectus thrives and eventually comes in contact with or evolves into modern Homo sapiens in those particular locations. Java, Indonesia doesn't necessarily believe Homo erectus evolved, but that Homo sapiens eventually replaced the population of Homo erectus. But there is some overlap in them living together. And I'm usually the weird person who wants to envision what that may have been like. I wonder if they had cultural rules. You know, like we have rules about who you can't date. I wonder if they did. Don't date those people. I don't know. Those people are the different ones. I always wonder how these things happen, but there's a lot of overlap between Homo sapien and Homo erectus in terms of living. Our earliest ancestors came in contact with both the Neanderthals and Homo erectus. Pretty cool. If you ask me. Now, when it comes to Neanderthal up in Europe, and you'll read this too, that Neanderthal is believed to have never stepped foot in Africa because of recent tests that have been done. Neanderthals were also found to share the majority of our DNA. And so it is believed that quite possibly, after finding Neanderthal traits within living humans today, that Neanderthals mated with humans. And this mating happened at the first encounter outside of Africa. So as Homo sapiens were leaving the continent, they encountered Neanderthals, mated with them, and those descendants spread out all over the world. So that's why majority of Africans do not have Neanderthal traits, because they are still contained in the continent of Africa, despite other people moving around and mating with them. But more people have Neanderthal traits if their ancestors left Africa many moons ago. All right, so that's Neanderthal. You'll get into that, like all the different cultural stuff. I believe we have a whole film on it. You ready? Dun 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 dun. Okay. I was trying to make it dramatic enough. All right, welcome to you, your skull. This is Homo sapien. Please, disclaimer: do not harm anyone in your own attempt to observe a human skull. You can look at photos online of skulls. Yes? Understood. Okay, great. All right. Now look at the brow ridge. We actually have a forehead. If we had Neanderthal here, you would see the huge brow ridge too. So it's not very different. God, I gotta go find my Neanderthal. Look at this skull. Do you see a crest or a keel? Rounded, the back, sharper. So our spine attaches better to the back of the skull, so we hold it up better. You can imagine Homo erectus had a pretty successful system too, that they felt comfortable enough to travel out of Africa. I wouldn't even take a train across any country in Africa, let alone walk up out of Africa. You know how big Africa is? If I had to start, I'd move down the way 30 miles. And then my next generation had to move the next 30 miles, the next 30 miles before we made it out. It'd be the slowest process ever. All right. Other things, teeth. Look at those teeth. All right, we know our spine. Woo! Driving myself crazy. We know our spine also curves, but not as much as the ape. We know our pelvis is wider for bipedal walking. Oh, tore my back. And we know that we do not have a divergent big toe. Our feet are closer together. It gives better support. Could you imagine walking on just this? That toe gives you more even support for walking. And many of our arches are starting to go down, so a lot of people believed for a time that the arches alone could tell you if you were closer to an ape or a human if you had a high arch, which is comedy. I think any of these rules are crazy. But you can see the physical examples we have here of how our human legacy has altered over time. Now, these are just replicas. These are not the actual individuals that existed because Southwest is not so big time we could house the originals. Not to mention, they were dug up. And so if we had them, we would probably destroy them because sometimes these stay in my car for endless amount of hours. So nonetheless, it's great that we have replicas. I've actually ordered a lot more replicas and full body ones so you could really see the way the bodies are. If you continue to go to Southwest next semester, they should be here. But hopefully this answers a lot of your questions and gaps. I know sometimes the chapters, I believe 7 through 10, can seem so surreal, especially if you've grown up thinking another thing about evolution. But the skulls are real. They really have been found in these various locations. And it may be, maybe you're the scientist to contribute to it, that our interpretation of how evolution has happened is flawed. But for now, based on these skeletons, this is the initial idea of how the body has changed and what forces have sort of contributed to those specific changes. Okay? If you have any other questions about the primates or the hominins or any of the genus Homo that is currently us, or the Homo erectus or habilis, or there are several of us, Ergaster, please let me know. But you can also consult with your book. I believe you guys have a pretty awesome appendix section that goes over many of the species and their skulls in the very back of your book. So check it out. And I will see you next video, which I'm not sure what it's going to be about. I'm probably going to be gossiping about humans. All right. You have a good day.